The sun was already high when Clara stumbled across the uneven dirt yard, her arms heavy with a sloshing bucket of feed. The pen squealed with hungry pigs, their snouts pushing against the wooden rails, impatient for her to pour the grain. She meant to walk steady, she really did, but one boot caught the other, and the bucket tilted forward before she could steady it. A wave of wet slop splashed over the edge, landing squarely on her skirt. The sound of laughter cut sharper than the stench. Clumsy Clara. One of the ranch hands hollered from the fence, slapping his thigh as though it were the best joke of the day. Don't let her near the horses, she'd drown him in slop. Others joined in, their chuckles following her like cruel shadows. Clara lowered her head. She had learned long ago not to answer back. Words only gave them more to laugh at. Instead, she pushed her damp hair behind her ears, squared her shoulders, and emptied what was left of the feed into the trough. The pigs didn't care if she was clumsy. They only cared that their bellies were full. The town, though, that was another matter. Whenever Clara ventured beyond the ranch, it seemed eyes found her stumbles before they noticed anything else. In the mercantile, she had once dropped a jar of molasses, and the sticky mess had made her a story for weeks. At the church social, she tripped tearing a pie, face first, into her neighbor's lap. Even now, months later, the whispers hadn't stopped. Hog pen Clara. Can't walk straight to save her life. Doubt it was easier to stay near the hogs, where the jeers couldn't reach her. Here, at least, she was useful. But on that particular morning, Clara was not as alone as she thought. Leaning against the far fence post stood a man whose presence was quiet but undeniable. His dark braids fell over his shoulders, his expression calm and unreadable as he watched the scene unfold. He wore a weathered buckskin shirt, the kind few dared wear openly in town, and a knife rested at his hip. His eyes were steady, neither mocking nor pitying, but measuring, as though he saw something no one else bothered to look for. Clara glanced his way only once before looking down again, heat rushing to her cheeks. She had seen him before, always on the edges of gatherings, sometimes trading pelts or horses. Folks whispered about him too, though in a different way, half respect, half suspicion. He was Apache, and though this land had once been his people's long before it was fenced, most townsfolk treated him like an intruder who didn't belong. But unlike the others, he did not laugh at her. She tried to hurry, gathering the bucket and brushing at her skirt, though the stains would never come out. Each step seemed heavier than the last. The ranch hands drifted back to their chores, still chuckling. Clara clenched her jaw, determined not to let the tears rise this time. As she made her way toward the pump to rinse the bucket, she felt the weight of those dark eyes following her. It was unsettling, yet strangely steadying too. For the first time in a long while, she wondered, could someone truly see her, not just her stumbles? The hogs grunted behind her, the laughter faded, but that silent gaze remained etched in her thoughts. She shook her head and forced herself back to work, telling herself it meant nothing. After all, men only saw what they wanted to see. Still, Clara couldn't shake the smallest flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't as invisible or as worthless as they all believed. The pump handle squeaked in protest as Clara worked it up and down, water splashing over the rim of the bucket. She scrubbed at the wood with her apron, but the sour smell of hog feed clung stubbornly. Her arms ached, though it wasn't the bucket that weighed her down, it was the laughter that still rang in her ears. She was so lost in thought that she didn't hear the footsteps until a shadow stretched across the ground beside her. Did not spill much, a quiet voice said. Clara stiffened. Slowly, she turned, the bucket slipping from her fingers and clattering against the pump. The Apache man stood there, close enough now that she could see the faint scar across his jaw and the steady calm in his eyes. Her mouth went dry. Nobody, especially not a stranger, ever came to her defense. She expected a smirk, maybe even another joke. But he only watched her with the same unreadable expression, as though he was trying to piece together something she herself couldn't see. I always spill," Clara muttered, stooping quickly to pick up the bucket. "That's why they laugh." She tried to sound casual, though her cheeks burned. "They laugh because it is easier than seeing truth," he said simply. Clara blinked. "Truth?" "You feed them," he said, nodding toward the hogs. "Even when they mock you, you keep working. They see clumsy steps, but I see strong hands." Clara's heart gave a strange, unfamiliar flutter. She had never heard words like that before, not directed at her. People called her a burden, a mess, a girl who'd never catch a husband. Never strong, never worthy. I don't know what to say," she whispered. Brushing a stray strand of hair from her face, he tilted his head, the faintest curve touching his mouth, not quite a smile, but close. "Then say nothing. Truth does not need words." For a long moment, silence stretched between them. Clara's hands trembled against the bucket's handle, but not from fear. There was something in his gaze steady, unwavering, that made her feel as though she were not standing in mud, not wearing stained skirts, not branded by every mistake she'd ever made. For once she felt seen. "I should finish chores," she managed, her voice thin. He stepped back, respectful, yet he did not look away. "I will help. You? You don't have to." "I choose to," he said, already moving toward the woodpile. With practiced ease, he hefted an armful of logs and carried them to the smokehouse. No wasted movement, no clumsiness, each step measured, balanced. Clara's eyes followed him without meaning to, the contrast between them sharp and humbling. Yet instead of feeling small, she felt something else stir inside her, the wish to learn that by the time the sun dipped lower, he had carried logs, fetched water, and even repaired a broken latch on the pen. Clara watched from a distance, half afraid to speak, half afraid that if she did, he would vanish like a dream. When he finally straightened, brushing dust from his hands, he looked toward her again. "Tomorrow," he said, as though it were not a question. "Tomorrow?" She echoed. "I will come," he replied. "To help." And with that, he walked away silent, steady, leaving Clara clutching her apron, her heart thudding faster than she ever remembered. For the first time in years, the hog pen didn't feel like a prison. It felt like the beginning of something she had never dared imagine. The morning broke bright and still, a fine mist lifting off the fields. Clara woke with her stomach knotted. She told herself he wouldn't return. Men never lingered, especially not around her. Yet as she tied her apron and stepped into the yard, her eyes searched the horizon all the same. She fed the hogs quickly, trying not to hope, but hope had a stubborn way of creeping in. Then she heard it, the steady tread of boots, measured and calm. Clara turned, her breath catching. He was there. The Apache man strode across the yard, a coil of rope slung across his shoulder, his posture easy as though he had every right to be there. He gave a single nod, his eyes meeting hers with quiet certainty. "You came," she whispered before she could stop herself. "I said I would," he replied simply. Together they set to work. He braced the trough while she held the board steady, his hand sure and strong where hers shook. Somehow, when he moved beside her, she found herself less clumsy. Her hands followed his rhythm, her steps matching his. For once, she didn't feel like she was fighting against the world or against herself, but not everyone was blind to their closeness. "Would you look at that?" One of the ranch hands drawled from the fence line. Hog pen Clara's found herself a savage shadow. Laughter rang out, cruel and sharp. Another spat tobacco juice into the dust. "Better watch it, girl. He'll run off with more than your pigs." Clara froze, shame washing over her like cold water. Her fingers slipped on the rope, and she ducked her head, waiting for the Apache man to step away. That was what always happened. People kept their distance once the laughter began, But he didn't move. Slowly, he straightened to his full height, his eyes lifting to meet the men at the fence. He said nothing, no harsh words, no heated defense. Only silence. His gaze was dark, unwavering, steady as stone. The laughter faltered. The ranch hands shifted, uneasy under the weight of that wordless stare. One by one, they broke away, muttering excuses as they returned to their chores. Clara's heart hammered in her chest. She stared at him, astonished. "Why didn't you say anything?" She whispered. "Words are weak," he said softly. Eyes carry farther. Clara let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. For the first time, she wasn't left alone with the sting of mockery. Someone had stood with her, not with noise, but with presence. "They've always laughed at me," she admitted, her voice small. "I don't know how to stop hearing it." His expression shifted, gentling. "When I was young, they laughed at me too. Called me thin, useless. But I learned their voices are wind. You must hear beyond it." Clara blinked, her throat tight. No one had ever said such a thing to her. No one had ever admitted they, too, had been marked by scorn. For once, she didn't feel entirely alone. The rest of the day passed in quiet rhythm. They hauled water, patched the fence, stacked wood. She tripped once in the mud, and instead of mockery, he only extended his hand. She took it, her fingers trembling in his, and for a fleeting moment, the world felt steady beneath her feet. But as the sun lowered, Clara caught the sideways glances from the ranch hands, their whispers carried by the evening wind. Gossip had already taken root. She knew by nightfall the whole town would be talking. Hog pen Clara, plain and clumsy, keeping company with an Apache man. The thought made her stomach twist with dread. Yet as he walked beside her toward the hog pen, quiet and certain, she realized something had shifted inside her. For once, their laughter didn't echo so loudly because he was still there by the next market day. Whispers had spread like wildfire. Clara felt them before she even stepped onto the main street, the sideways glances, the half-smiles that weren't smiles at all. She clutched her basket tighter, wishing she could shrink into the cobblestones. Hog pen Clara's found herself a brave one. A woman snickered to her friend as Clara passed. "Must be desperate no white man would want her." Clara's cheeks burned. She kept her eyes low, pretending she hadn't heard. Though the words stabbed deep at the mercantile, things grew worse. Two ranch wives lingered by the bolts of fabric, their voices pitched just loud enough. "Imagine him touching her, smelling like hog slop," one murmured. "Clumsy hands like hers?" "She'd spill the stew pot before he ever tasted it," the other replied. Their laughter followed, Clara all the way to the counter. She fumbled with her coins, nearly dropping them, and the clerk smirked as though confirming the women's words. By the time she stepped outside, her throat ached from holding back tears. And there he was, the Apache man, waiting with his quiet stance near the hitching post. He carried no judgment in his eyes, only a stillness that unsettled her more than the mockery. "You came," he said simply, taking the basket from her without asking. Clara hesitated. She wanted to smile, to thank him, but the sting of the whispers clung like burrs. "You shouldn't," she murmured. "People will talk more if they see you with me." "Let them," he said. "It's not that simple," she whispered, her voice breaking. "They already call me Hog pen Clara. I've been laughed at my whole life. And now they laugh because of you too." He stopped walking, turning to face her in the middle of the street. His eyes searched hers, steady and unwavering. "Does their laughter make your hands weaker?" Clara faltered. "What? Does it stop you from feeding hogs? From working every day? From standing here now?" She swallowed hard. "No, but then it is only noise," he said firmly. "Noise cannot change truth." Clara wanted to believe him. His words carried weight, like stones dropped into the rushing stream of her doubt. And yet, What if the townsfolk were right? What if she wasn't worthy of his respect, let alone his company? Back at the ranch hand's stares felt sharper than before. They spoke in low tones that silenced when she entered, their smirks trailing her every move. That night, as she sat alone by the fire, Clara's doubts gnawed at her like hungry hogs. Why would he choose to stand beside her? She was clumsy, plain, a laughingstock. Maybe the town was right, maybe he pitied her. Maybe she was foolish to let his steady eyes stir hope where none belonged. The door creaked, and she started. He stood there in the firelight, his expression shadowed but calm. "You hide," he said softly. Clara flushed, twisting her apron in her hands. I just don't want to make things harder for you." He stepped closer, his voice low but certain. "It is not harder. It is choice. My choice." Her eyes stung with tears. "But why me?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached for the firewood, placing another log on the flames. The light flickered across his face as he finally spoke. "Because you do not see yourself yet." "But I do." Clara's breath caught. The fire crackled. The hogs grunted outside in their pen. And for the first time, she wondered if perhaps, just perhaps, the truth he spoke could be real. The storm rolled in without warning. By dusk, the sky was split with lightning, thunder shaking the ground like hooves of 1,000 wild horses. Clara rushed across the yard, skirts whipping against her legs, the smell of rain thick in the air. The hogs squealed, panicked by the rumble, their pen rattling as they pressed against the rails. Then the wind came sharp, furious, tearing shingles from the barn roof. Clara's heart pounded as she saw the trough overturn, rolling dangerously toward the fence. If it smashed through, the hogs would scatter into the storm, lost or worse. "Clara!" One of the ranch hands shouted from the porch, but not with help in his voice. Only warning. He wasn't coming. None of them were. She grabbed the rope she and the Apache man had repaired just days before and sprinted into the pen. Mud sucked at her boots, rain stung her face, but she pressed forward, fighting against the hogs' frantic bodies. Her hands slipped, her knees hit the ground more than once, but she scrambled up again, refusing to stop. The thunder cracked so loud it rattled her teeth. The hogs screamed, slamming into her legs. She nearly fell headlong into the mud, but a hand caught her arm. "He was there, Dot." The Apache man pulled her upright, his grip steady even as the wind howled. "Together," he shouted over the storm. Dot side by side, they fought to push the trough back into place. Her arms burned, her chest ached, but she dug in her heels and strained with all her might. Finally, with one last heave, it toppled into position, wedging against the fence. Clara gasped for breath, the rain plastering her hair to her face. But it wasn't over. The latch on the pen gate had snapped loose, the hogs slamming against it with every bolt of lightning. Clara's eyes widened. If they broke through, chaos would swallow them all. Before he could move, Clara lunged forward. She wrapped the rope around the post, fumbling with trembling hands, tying knots the way he had taught her. The gate shuddered, the hogs pressed harder, but the rope held. When the worst of the storm passed, the hogs settled into uneasy grunts. Clara sagged against the post, her body shaking from exhaustion. Mud covered her from head to toe, her skirt ripped at the hem, but the pen stood strong. The hogs were safe. For a moment, there was only the sound of rain easing into a steady patter. Then applause, slow, mocking, broke the silence. The ranch hands stood on the porch, dry and untouched by the storm. One of them called out, "Well, I'll be." Hog Pen Clara finally found something she can't trip over lightning bolts. Laughter followed, cruel and sharp. Clara's heart clenched. For a moment, the familiar shame threatened to return. But then she felt the Apache man's hand on her shoulder, grounding her. She lifted her chin. "Laugh all you want," she said. surprising even herself with the strength in her voice. "But the hogs are safe, and none of you lifted a finger." The porch fell silent. No one spoke. The Apache man looked at her, his eyes dark and steady, pride glimmering faintly in their depths. "Strong hands," he said quietly, and for the first time in her life, Clara believed it. The morning after the storm, the ranch yard bore scars of the night's fury. Branches littered the ground, shingles lay broken in the dirt, and puddles spread wide where the rain had carved trenches. But the hog pen stood firm, and the animals inside grunted contentedly. Safe and unscathed, Clara moved stiffly, her body sore from the struggle, but her spirit strangely lighter. She had tied that rope. She had stood in the storm and held her ground. And though the memory of laughter still lingered, so too did the echo of his word-strong hands. By mid-morning, neighbors arrived to check the damage. Word of the storm had already spread into town, and with it, tales of hog pen Clara and the Apache man who had stood beside her. At first, Clara shrank from their eyes, certain they would mock her again. But something was different. "Never thought she had it in her," a ranch wife murmured, though her tone was begrudging. "She saved the whole pen, that's for sure," another admitted. A ranch hand scratched his head. "Stronger than I figured." The words weren't warm, not exactly, but they weren't sharp-edged with scorn either. Clara felt a small, cautious flicker of pride. For once, she was not the butt of every joke, but others weren't so ready to soften. She wouldn't have managed. "A thing without him," one man muttered, jerking his chin toward the Apache, who stood at the fence line silent as ever. "Best not forget whose hands really did the work." Clara's cheeks flushed, anger sparking in her chest. Before, she might have stayed silent, but something had shifted. "His hands and mine," she said firmly, her voice carrying across the yard. "We did it together." The man's eyebrows rose, as though startled to hear her speak with such surety. A few chuckles rippled, but it wasn't the cruel laughter Clara had grown used to. It was something else. Surprised. Later, when the yard was quiet again, Clara busied herself gathering fallen branches. He joined her wordlessly, carrying heavier loads with ease, until finally she asked, "Why do you keep coming back?" He set the wood down, then looked at her with that same calm that always made her feel both unsettled and safe. "Because you do not hide from the storm," he said. "You stand in it," Clara swallowed, her heart thudding. "But I was afraid." "Courage is not the absence of fear," he replied. "It is standing while afraid." Her chest tightened, warmth spreading through her like sunlight breaking through clouds. She wanted to tell him how much his words meant, how they gave her strength she didn't know she had. But before she could, a rider galloped into the yard, dust flying behind the horse. It was one of the ranch hands from the neighboring spread, his face pale with urgency. "Flood washed out the north bridge," he shouted. "Cattle scattered into the ravine. We'll lose half the herd if we can't get them out." The rancher cursed, barking orders to the men. Panic buzzed through the yard like a hive of hornets. Clara felt her stomach twist. Cattle in a ravine meant danger, real danger. The ground there was slick, the water rising fast. As the ranch hands scrambled for ropes and saddles, she glanced toward the Apache man. He met her gaze without words, and in that silent exchange she knew. This was not over. The storm had tested her, but another trial, fiercer and more dangerous, waited just ahead. The ride to the ravine was a blur of hooves pounding earth, shouts cutting through the air, and Clara's heart hammering as though it might leap from her chest. She wasn't meant to be there. Women didn't ride into danger with the men, but something inside her refused to stay behind. The Apache rode near her, his presence a steadying weight. He didn't ask why she came. He didn't have to. She belonged to this struggle now, storm-tested, rope-burned, and unwilling to let fear bind her again. When they reached the ravine, Clara's breath caught. The land had torn open in the night storm. Mud slicked the slopes, water roared at the bottom, and cattle bawled in wild-eyed panic. Several steers teetered dangerously close to the edge, hooves sliding. "Keep them from going over!" The rancher bellowed, spurring his horse toward the herd. Men scattered, ropes flying, shouts rising in the chaos. Clara swung down from her horse, boots sinking into the sucking mud. She grabbed a fallen branch, waving it to drive the nearest cattle back from the lip of the ravine. Her skirts clung heavy with water, each step a battle, but she forced herself forward. "Girl, get back!" One of the ranch hands shouted. "You'll get yourself killed." But Clara didn't move. Her eyes fixed on a small heifer, legs splaying as it slid toward the drop. Without thinking, Clara lunged. Her hand seized the rope tied around the animal's neck, jerking it back with all the strength her arms could summon. The heifer bleated, fighting her, dragging her toward the edge. Mud gave way under her boots. Clara's breath hitched in terror. She could feel the pull, the inevitability of falling. Then a strong hand clamped over hers on the rope. He was there, the Apache, his stance solid against the sucking ground. Together they pulled, muscles straining, until the heifer scrambled back to safer ground. Clara gasped, mud streaking her face, heart pounding. She wanted to laugh, to cry, to collapse. But there was no time. More cattle pressed dangerously close, and the water below grew higher. "Faster. Again," he said simply, his voice low, calm, steady. And again they worked side by side, mud slick, sweat-soaked, pulling beast after beast from the edge. Her arms screamed in pain, her legs trembled, but Clara did not stop. The memory of being laughed at, of being the clumsy hog pen girl, burned behind her eyes. She would not falter. Not here. Not now. Hours seemed to blur into moments until, finally, the last steer was driven back, bawling but alive. The men, mud-splattered and exhausted, stood in disbelief. They had expected disaster, but somehow, through sheer grit and will, the herd had been saved. The rancher rode up, wiping mud from his brow. His gaze fell on Clara, standing there with the Apache, rope in hand, breath heaving. For the first time in her life, she saw no mockery in his eyes. Only respect. "You've got more fight in you than half my men," he admitted gruffly. Clara's chest tightened, her throat too thick to speak. She glanced at the Apache, but he was already turning away, silent as ever, as though saving cattle from a ravine was nothing worth remarking upon. But in her heart, Clara knew. This was not just about cattle. This was about her. About the strength no one else had ever seen until he did. And now, so did everyone else. By the time the herd was secure, the sun was sliding low on the horizon, painting the sky in streaks of red and gold. Clara's body ached in every bone, her dress clung with mud, and her arms were raw from rope burns, but she had never felt more alive. When they rode back into the ranch yard, the others dismounted stiffly, too weary for words. But Clara noticed their eyes. The same men who had once laughed at her clumsiness now looked at her differently. Not with open admiration, not yet, but with something close to it. A grudging respect, heavy and silent. The rancher's wife pressed a cup of water into Clara's hands, her voice softer than usual. "You saved more than hogs this time." Clara managed a tired smile, but her gaze drifted toward the Apache. He stood apart as he always did, silent, watchful. Mud streaked his arms, his hair was damp with sweat, but he held himself tall, unbothered. When his eyes met hers, just for an instant, something warm and steady passed between them, something neither dared put into words. By the next day, the gossip had begun. In town, women whispered in the mercantile, their voices sharp as sewing needles. "Did you hear? That clumsy hog girl was out in the ravine with the men. Pulled cattle like she was born for it." but only because he was there. Oh, I've seen the way she looks at him. An Apache, no less. Imagine the scandal. Clara heard the whispers even before she reached the counter. The shopkeeper gave her a curt nod, his wife's lips tight as though she swallowed something sour. Clara's cheeks burned hot, and she kept her chin down, clutching the small sack of flour she had come for. On the way out, she caught a cruel snicker. Maybe she'll marry her hogs or her savage. The words cut sharper than any rope burn. Clara's stomach twisted, shame and fury battling inside her. She wanted to scream that they were wrong, that what they saw was not shameful but strong, right, real. But the words stuck in her throat. That evening, as she tended the hogs, she heard a quiet step behind her. She turned to see him, the Apache, standing just beyond the fence. "They speak," he said simply, as though he already knew. Clara swallowed hard. "They always do. But this time—" Her voice cracked. "This time it's worse." He studied her for a long moment, his gaze steady, unreadable. Then he stepped closer, close enough that she could see the dried mud still clinging to his boots. "Their voices are small," he said. "The storm, the river, the cattle, they do not bend you. Why bend to whispers?" Clara blinked back sudden tears. "Because whispers last longer than storms." For the first time, his expression softened, the faintest hint of a smile touching his lips. "Not if you speak louder." Her heart thudded in her chest. She had never thought of herself as someone who could speak louder than gossip, louder than cruelty. But when he said it, she almost believed. That night, lying in her small room, Clara stared at the ceiling. Outside, the ranch was quiet, but inside her heart a storm brewed. She had stood in rain and mud, pulled cattle from death's edge, and felt stronger than she ever had. Yet here, under the weight of whispers, she felt small again. But perhaps he was right. Perhaps it was time to stop being small. The following Sunday, the little wooden church at the edge of town filled with the hum of voices and the rustle of skirts. Clara slipped in quietly, as she always did, choosing a bench near the back. She kept her eyes lowered, though she felt the prickle of stares even before the hymns began. The gossip had not died down, it had only sharpened. She could feel it in every glance, hear it in every hissed whisper. Sat in the mud with him, like they were equals. No decent girl behaved so. Her poor mother, God rest her soul, what would she think? Clara gripped the worn wood of the bench until her knuckles ached. She told herself to stay still, to stay quiet, to let it pass as she always had. But something inside her refused to bend this time. His words echoed in her heart. Why bend to whispers? Speak louder. When the pastor asked for announcements, Clara rose. The movement startled those nearest to her. A few gasps rippled as she stepped into the aisle, skirts brushing the floor. Her voice trembled at first, but it grew steadier with each word. "I've heard what's been said about me," she began, her gaze sweeping the room. "That I'm clumsy, foolish, not fit for more than mucking in a hog pen. That I stood in the mud because of him, not because of me." Murmurs stirred, but Clara raised her chin. "You're wrong. I have stood in storms. I've held ropes that burned my hands raw. I've pulled cattle back from death when others would have let them fall. I was afraid, but I did it anyway. That is not weakness. That is strength." The room fell into uneasy silence. Faces stared back at her, some shocked, some uncomfortable, some unreadable. Clara drew a breath, her heart hammering. "And if you think I should be ashamed for working beside the one man who saw worth in me before any of you did, then you know less of shame than I do." Her words struck like stones cast into still water, rippling through the pews. A few women looked down, cheeks flushed. The rancher, sitting near the front, gave a slow nod, his jaw tight but approving. But not all were swayed. A sharp voice from the side cut through. You disgrace yourself, Clara, and this town." Clara's chest heaved. For a moment, the weight of old fear pressed down on her. But then, in the back of the church, she saw him. The Apache stood near the door, arms crossed, watching. He gave no nod, spoke no word, but his steady gaze anchored her. She straightened. "If speaking truth is disgrace, then I'll carry it gladly." With that, she turned and walked back to her bench, the echo of her words hanging heavy in the still air. The service stumbled on after that, but the whispers were gone. No one dared mock her aloud, not after she had spoken. Later, as the congregation spilled out into the sunlight, Clara felt the weight of eyes on her again. But this time, it wasn't derision. It was something else: curiosity, wariness, maybe even respect. And for the first time in her life, Clara did not shrink from their gaze. The days after the church service felt different, though nothing in town had truly changed. Clara still walked the same dirt roads, tended the same hogs, and wore the same hand-mended dresses. Yet the air around her seemed lighter, her step stronger. People no longer laughed when she passed. Some offered curt nods, others avoided her gaze entirely, but the cruel whispers had quieted. Respect did not come all at once. It was not handed, but earned. Clara knew this, and she knew she had only just begun. One evening, she stood at the hog pen as the sun bled red and gold across the sky. The animals rooted contentedly, and the air smelled of earth after rain. She thought of all the time she had hated this place, hated the mud and the smell, hated being called Hog Pen Clara. Yet now she looked at it differently. The pen had been her burden, but also her proving ground. It was here she had been mocked. It was here she had stood against storm and laughter alike. And it was here he had seen her worth. She heard footsteps behind her and turned. The Apache man stood there, tall and steady, as though the world itself could not shake him. "They look at you differently now," he said. Clara nodded. "Not kindly. Not yet. But they don't laugh anymore." A faint smile tugged at his lips. "That is enough." Silence stretched between them, warm and unhurried. For the first time, Clara did not feel the need to fill it. She only looked at him, and in his dark eyes she saw something she had longed for her whole life: recognition, not of what she lacked, but of what she was. Finally, she spoke, her voice quiet but sure. "You were the first to see me. Before the storm. Before the cattle. Before I found the strength myself." He inclined his head as though it were the simplest truth. "I saw what was already there." Her throat tightened. She had never imagined herself here, mud-streaked, rope-burned, yet standing taller than she ever had. And she had never imagined that someone would look at her and see not clumsiness, not foolishness, but worth. "Will you stay?" she asked softly, almost afraid of the answer. His gaze held hers, steady and unflinching. "If you ask," Clara drew a long breath. She thought of the whispers, the gossip, the sharp tongues that would wag louder than ever if she chose this path. But she also thought of storms weathered, cattle saved, a voice she had finally found. "I'm asking," she said. For a moment, he said nothing. Then he stepped closer, closing the space between them, until she could feel the quiet strength radiating from him. "Then I will stand beside you," he said simply. The sun slipped lower, casting them both in its glow. Around them, the hogs snorted and rooted, the same as they always had. But Clara no longer cared if the world laughed. She was not Hog Pen Clara anymore. She was a woman who had stood in storms, spoken against whispers, and chosen her own future. And as he stood beside her, steady and true, Clara knew she had finally become something no one could mock. She had become herself.